Just imagine, back there before any printer, long before any copying technology, an entire people carried their stories, their laws and their beliefs in their heads, passing everything orally, from father to son. And little by little, they began to record everything on parchment, like someone creating a collective diary, full of adventures, prophecies, and deep reflections. This is the journey that culminated in the creation of the Bible. A book that spent centuries being written, revised, discussed, and in some cases, even censored. It wasn't simple, much less quick. So when we talk about the creation of the Bible, we are talking about centuries of history, about teamwork, or if you prefer, a collaborative book made by many hands, minds, and souls in search of the sacred. Want to know how this all happened? Let's divide it into three parts. First, the oral tradition, then the expansion of Jewish writings, and finally, the emergence of the New Testament and the Bible as we know it. So let's go. Imagine a people without books, without the internet, with absolutely nothing to record their stories other than their own memories. That was the Hebrew people back in 1200 BC, a people who had been through a lot, like the famous story of the Exodus, when they left Egypt. Everyone knew these stories because it was a true ritual to tell them around the campfire or during celebrations, passing them down from generation to generation, as if it were a sacred and family tradition. And the tradition was this: each generation would tell the stories of their ancestors, the laws of God, and the life lessons they believed were vital. This was not a simple thing to memorize. It was a way of educating the next generation, keeping their identity alive. This was done with such care and seriousness that over time, these stories began to take shape and importance. They were the center of the lives of the Hebrew people. Then, at some point, around the year 1000 BC, someone had the idea of putting all this in writing. They started writing down the laws, the stories of their ancestors, and the famous Torah, that initial part of the Bible that tells the story of the creation of the world up to the laws of Moses. Can you imagine how important this was? They were taking ancient stories and literally putting everything on paper, or rather on the parchments of the time. And that was how, little by little, the first piece of the Bible began to emerge. Thus, as time passed and the legends began to take on the touch of reality, this collection of stories and laws became increasingly solid. Those written words ceased to be mere memories and became a foundation, an anchor of the identity of the Jewish people. Now imagine that the Hebrew people already had the Torah, those first 5 books that tell the stories of creation, the adventures of the patriarchs, and the laws of Moses. But look, the history of the people of Israel didn't stop there. A lot happened later. The Jewish people went through wars, defeats, reconstructions, rebellious prophets, problematic kings, practically a script for a drama series. As time went by, other important texts began to emerge. There were stories of kings and battles, poems and songs, like the Psalms, which many people still use as prayers today, proverbs full of wisdom, and messages from prophets who, in fact, were almost like social critics of the time. They were always telling people that they needed to correct themselves, to turn to God, and announcing what was to come. These prophets didn't let anything go by. They pointed out everything the people did wrong. These texts were added to the Torah, and soon a collection of sacred books was formed that became known as the Tanakh, or as we call it, the Old Testament. But here's the thing, it wasn't overnight that they decided which books would enter this sacred club. It was a very serious matter, and around the 1st century AD, the Jewish community began to define which writings were inspired by God and worthy of being considered sacred. This happened after much discussion, because not everyone agreed on what should be there. Meanwhile, the Tanakh was emerging as the definitive collection of the stories and teachings of the Jewish people, and it became essential to maintaining their identity, especially in times of crisis and exile. These texts were the glue that held the people together, even when they were far from their homeland. But first, I need to ask you, are you enjoying it? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos and leave a like. We have reached the final part, where things really take on a new chapter. So imagine that, in the midst of all this, a new figure emerges, Jesus of Nazareth. He began to preach, gather followers, and bring a message of love, compassion, and a new vision about the relationship with God. After his death, His disciples, who believed that he was the promised Messiah, began to spread his teachings throughout the world. However, as you can imagine, no one had an instruction manual for Jesus, so everything was still passed on by word of mouth and through letters. In the years after Jesus' death, early Christians began to feel the need to record these stories and teachings, especially since they were spreading across many regions. Thus, the four Gospels began to emerge: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which spoke about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, each with a different perspective and audience. In addition, letters from Paul, one of the first Christian leaders, also appeared, who traveled and wrote to various communities explaining Jesus' teachings and guiding Christian life. Now, do you think that these writings were quickly gathered together and accepted? That was not the case. In the early centuries of Christianity, there was a mixture of texts circulating among Christian communities. Some accepted certain texts, others had different gospels, and there was a real holy mess. It was only in the 4th century, when Christianity began to grow within the Roman Empire, that religious leaders realized that an agreement was needed on which texts would be considered authentic and inspired by God. During the Council of Nicaea and other councils that followed, the 27 books that make up the New Testament were defined. They brought together the Gospels, Paul's letters, and other writings considered important to the Christian faith. Now, with the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, and the New Testament, the Christian texts, the Bible as we know it today was formed. From then on, this book of books began to be copied and distributed in monasteries and churches, gaining sacred status for millions of people. And so, after centuries of stories, traditions, debates, and writings, the Bible was established as the most influential and translated book in history, uniting Jewish tradition and Christian teachings into a single sacred narrative. So that's today's video. I hope you liked it. See you in the next story.